Fellow here. It's a great pleasure to introduce Philip Gordon, who we first spent significant time together in Afghanistan on a NATO trip in 2005. Phil is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, previously Director for European Affairs at the NSC, and has a PhD from Johns Hopkins, author of Winning the Right War, a very well-written book, a very clearly argued book, which he'll talk about today. And so Phil will speak for a little while. We'll have a question and answer session, and then he'll sign books afterwards. Thanks very much.
Peter, thank you. It's really nice to be here, and it's particularly nice to be here under your auspices. Peter Bergen, I think, is really one of the best analysts of these issues. As he said, we spent some time in Afghanistan together. You share a tent with somebody, you get to know them a little bit, and I respected him well before that, and I'm really pleased that he invited me over to talk about this issue today. Let me tell you what I want to do. I think 6 years into what we call the war on terror is a good time to step back and ask how we're doing, what balance sheet can we draw from the first 6 years, what can we learn from that, and what might we do differently. And I will stipulate and argue right from the start that 6 years into this we're not doing nearly as well as we should be. And let me tell you what I mean. Obviously, the United States hasn't been attacked since 2001. A lot of us probably thought there would be a major terrorist attack in the United States in these past few years. That hasn't happened. But more broadly, when you look at the balance sheet for the war on terror, there are other huge problems. We're bogged down in Iraq, 150,000 troops, no end in sight, costing $300 million a day. Iran making progress towards a nuclear weapon, destabilizing our efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq. No terrorist attack in the United States, but more broadly around the world, terrorist attacks proliferating, obviously Madrid, London, Bali, so on and so forth. U.S. prestige in the world, arguably at an all-time low, particularly in the Middle East. Look at any opinion poll where Hezbollah leader Nasrallah is more popular than President Bush, where people would rather see China or France be the dominant outside power in the region than the United States. I think on balance, we can argue this, but I just want to begin by putting it out there that 6 years into this war on terror, the strategies that we have been operating are largely failing. And so if that's more or less right, the question becomes why? Why is it that we haven't made more progress towards our ultimate goals in these 6 years? And there are a couple of possible hypotheses. One is simply that we just need more time. That this is a hard challenge, and it's true. It's an immense challenge. There's so much to be done. The president put forward a strategy of transforming the Middle East, and it takes time. Plenty of people argue that. Maybe. A second hypothesis for why we're not doing better so far is that we haven't been vigorous enough. Not that we've overreached or done the wrong things, but we need to get more serious about this. You hear that argument put forward, for example, by Newt Gingrich, who says the president's strategies aren't wrong, but they're failing. And they're failing because we need more energy, intensity, and resources. We need to up the ante. Gingrich says we're involved in World War III. Which gets me closer to my wrong war, right war argument that I want to make. Norman Podhoretz has a new book out as well. It's called World War IV. You can guess what the argument is. So that's another answer as to why we're not doing as well as we should be, that we just haven't been vigorous enough. We can discuss both of those hypotheses, but I think there's a different answer. It's implicit in the title of my book. I think the answer is that we've been fighting the wrong war. It's not that we just need more time or we need to fight it more vigorously, but we're thinking about it in the wrong way and going about it in the right way. As for this World War II, World War III, World War IV set of analogies, I think that's also the wrong analogy. Indeed, I think any analogy with the traditional war is the wrong way to think about this challenge that we face from radical Islam. Let me say two things about that. One is, even if you accept that analogy, or if you accept that analogy that this is an emerging World War III, as Gingrich says, or World War IV, as Podhoretz says, because he counts the Cold War as World War III, then you at least have to accept the consequences of that view. World War II We had a draft. We drafted a generation of young people. We mobilized 16 million soldiers. We spent 40% of GDP on defense. We invaded a number of major Middle Eastern and Asian countries, and we occupied them for a number of years. If you think that this is analogous, and the threat we face is so great, Islamofascism, it's like the threat from fascism or communism, communism in the form of the Soviet 120 divisions, and we need to do this sort of thing, fine. Make the argument that the threat is so great that we need to be prepared to fight World War III, and defend that, and defend the willingness to do all of those following things. See, I would even argue not only are we unprepared, that not only is that sort of devotion of resources and lives out of proportion to the threat, but I would argue it wouldn't even work. That even if we thought that this threat was as great as the threat from the fascists in World War II, that it's not clear to me that mobilizing 16 million and invading and occupying a number of Middle Eastern countries would get us to the result that we want. So that's why I think that's the wrong war. Indeed, as I say, I think any analogy with a traditional war is the wrong way to think about this problem. And if you want an analogy that I think works better, I would suggest the Cold War. And I would suggest that because the reason we called it a Cold War is it wasn't really a war at all, in the sense that it wasn't mainly about defeating the enemy militarily on a battlefield and imposing political terms. That's what a war is in normal parlance. The Cold War obviously had military elements to it, but in the end, what was it about? It was about defeating an enemy ideology and getting that enemy to give up on what it was fighting for. And that ultimately is how we won the Cold War. We didn't, in the end, defeat the Soviets on the ground and occupy the Kremlin and impose a new political system. We contained it until the point where people who were once infatuated with this ideology and supportive of the Soviet and the communist side decided that that was a failed ideology and gave up on it. And that is how I think we need to be thinking about this conflict, as a struggle against a violent, insidious, hostile ideology, but one that is doomed to fail, and we ought not perpetuate. Rather, we should try to control it. I'm sure we can discuss this analogy and its merits and drawbacks. None is perfect, but let me try to say what I think would emerge from an analogy with the Cold War, and I write about this in the book. What lessons are there from the last time we faced a threatening ideological struggle? And I think there are several that are actually quite relevant to the challenge that we're dealing with today. One is that containment can work. Or let me put it differently. Containment as a strategy can prove to be better than all the alternatives. And I put it that way because that's what containment was. It wasn't a fix-all solution to the problem we faced in 1947. Kennan didn't say, do this and everything will be fine. He just said that we need an alternative between capitulating to the threat and World War III. Because we realized at the time that World War III, right in the wake of World War II, was not something we wanted to fight. And that was particularly, it was even more true after the Soviets got nuclear weapons. And we needed some alternative between going to war, a massive global war again, and giving in and letting them have their way. So Kennan said this was better. And he said it may take some time, but ultimately the adversary would mellow. He had the insight that even though it was the Marxists-Leninists who said that our system would die of its own contradictions, it was actually their system that would die of its own contradictions. And I again suggest that might be worth keeping in mind today. Can we really not defeat the extremist version of Islam preached by Al-Qaeda and its like? I mean, are we really the ones, our societies and the way we're set up, who are going to fail in a competition with that ideology? That shouldn't be the case. So that was the insight of containment. And it was hard for Americans to accept, because Americans, with our history of great achievements and relative invulnerability, we're not used to living with vulnerability, and it's hard. And it was hard for Kennan descendants to have this message accepted among Americans, who were the greatest power in the world and weren't used to compromising with threats. But they did in the end. In every decade after containment was adopted, there were critics. And in the 1950s, John Foster Dulles and others said we shouldn't compromise with these immoral Soviets. We should roll back communism and drive them out of Eastern Europe. And in the 60s, Barry Goldwater said the same thing, and he criticized NATO and American strategy for being far too defensive and said we should go on the offensive. We're like a boxer who refuses to throw a punch, and the worst thing about our strategy is how defensive it is. In the 70s, neoconservatives came along and said the same thing about the moral compromises inherent in accepting communism, and we should challenge the Soviet Union. But ultimately, despite all of these critiques, which showed how uncomfortable Americans were with containment, we stuck to an essentially defensive strategy. And we did that right through the 1980s and right up until the point where what Kennan anticipated actually happened. By then, the Soviet ideology was not even convincing to those who were supposed to be abiding by it, and the whole apparatus fell around them, and we managed to defeat communism and transform the Soviet Union without having to fight World War III. It was hard for Americans to accept containment then, and it's hard to accept anything like containment now, because again, and this was actually even more true in the early 2000s than it is today, but especially in the early 2000s it was hard because we were powerful. I mean, 9/11 was a confluence of events. We were at the peak of our power because the 90s had been so spectacular, economic growth, military growth, enemy had disappeared, and we felt more vulnerable than ever after the 9/11 attack. And so, by golly, we were Americans. We're going to go out there and transform the world. And if it took invading Iraq and installing a democracy and transforming the Middle East, well, by golly, that's what we were going to do. We weren't just going to sit around and wait for this problem to go away. So that's the American inclination. But I would argue then, as now, there is something to be said for a containment strategy as an alternative to some efforts, some more offensive efforts, that can actually make things worse. And so containment, the Cold War, let's not be naive about it, was long and nasty, and it involved moral compromises and many setbacks. But in the end, it was better than World War III, and we ended up winning. And I ask you to think about that as a model for how to think about the current threat. So that's one point, that containment against such a threat can be better than its alternatives. A second thing I think, a second lesson I think emerges from the Cold War that's relevant today is that our values and ideas can be important weapons in this kind of a struggle. And that was also an insight that Kennan had right from the start. Again, with a twist on Marxism-Leninism, he was saying, no, we're the stronger society. If we preserve that, we can defeat them that way. And he argued right from the start in 1947 that the health and vigor of our own society would be one of the most important weapons we had in the struggle against the communists. And largely American presidents throughout the Cold War bought into that principle, that preserving what was good about our society was an important weapon in this battle of ideas with the communists. Now, let's be honest, they weren't always perfect, and all you have to do is mention Vietnam or Watergate to remember that we had our excesses in the Cold War as well. But at the end of the day, by the 1980s, it was clear which side had the right values and was more moral than the other. And I think that moral authority was an important weapon in persuading people who might otherwise been on the fence to back the Western side in the Cold War rather than the communist side. Now, again, I think there are real lessons in that for how we're fighting this battle today. And frankly, I think we have failed to draw those lessons in the way we've gone about it. We can get into the discussion, but what I'm getting at is the damage to America's reputation by things like the Guantanamo prison and holding prisoners indefinitely without charge, efforts by the administration to make it possible to mistreat prisoners or make torture not punished, black CIA prisons around the world, Abu Ghraib. The damage to our reputation and moral authority from these things, I would argue, is more costly than the benefits we get from doing such things. A third lesson from the Cold War has to do with alliances and friends. It would have been easy for American leaders in the early Cold War period to say to themselves, we're the most powerful country in the world, we're right, the enemies are wrong, and we're going to run our foreign policy as we see fit, and we're going to treat our allies as we see fit. They need us, and you run the alliance with an iron fist, and you brook no dissent, a little bit like the way the Soviets ran the Warsaw Pact. That would have been easy, but we didn't do it. We set up an alliance that really gave allies a say and a voice and a feeling of being part of a real alliance in a number of multinational institutions, but particularly NATO, where even the smallest allies had a seat at the table and a say. And again, I don't want to overstate the point, we were often hegemonic and resented as such. But we also, again, especially in comparison with our adversaries, made people feel like they belonged and they wanted to be on our side. The Norwegian historian Geir Lundestad talks about an American empire, but says it was an empire by invitation. The Allies wanted us in. We weren't there by imposing our force on them. And that proved hugely important during the Cold War, and more Allies wanted to be on our side than on the Soviet side. And there, too, I think we have failed largely to draw that lesson, and you see it in all sorts of ways, but the degree to which countries now want to ally with us as opposed to our adversaries is not where it needs to be, to say the least. On the contrary, now, allying with the United States is something that Democrats in the Middle East don't want to do, lest it tarnish them, something that it's difficult for even our democratic friends in Europe to do because we've made ourselves so unpopular with some of these counterproductive policies. There, too, I think there are lessons for now that we have to work on. And the last Cold War lesson I would underscore before having a few comments on the contemporary issues is how important it is to try to divide your enemy rather than do things that will unite it. And that was something we didn't always get right in the Cold War. It was only much later that we realized that this wasn't a monolith we were fighting. We tended, and Kennan again pointed this out about this American tendency always to find one single source of a threat somewhere in the world. We failed to see, we saw communism as a monolithic enemy and failed to see that the Chinese had different interests from the Soviets and the Vietnamese had different interests from the communists, and communist, so-called communist movements in the Third World were not always directed as part of some monolithic force from Moscow. And over time, we started to do what we could to divide those threats so that we weren't facing one common enemy, reaching out to China obviously being the most important part of that, the Vietnam War being a good example of where we failed to do it. And there, too, I think that we need to think about the lessons from that as we confront the enemy today. And you'll notice that President Bush often refers to the enemy when he means at the same time states like Iran or Iraq, but non-state actors like Al-Qaeda, Sunnis, but also Shia, Persians, but also Arabs, and tends to lump them all into the same single enemy. And that's not just a rhetorical point. It has concrete consequences. For example, when we're attacked on 9/11 by a Sunni non-state actor operating mostly out of Afghanistan, and part of the response is to attack the enemy in Iraq, a state that has nothing to do with the actor, the non-state actor that attacked us. Turning everyone into the enemy like that, and there are other examples, Israel's war with Hezbollah last summer, and the way we think about Hamas, that fall into this category of lumping the enemy all into one when we should be trying to divide it. And my argument is that if we're not careful, we actually do drive them together and create a sort of clash of civilizations that turns the entire Muslim world against us when we should be trying to divide it rather than unite it. So that, I would say, is a better model for thinking about what we're calling the war on terror. Let me make just a couple of other comments about how this plays out in the contemporary debate about what we do now. If you follow what I'm saying about the lessons of the Cold War, what are some of the things that come up now? There are a lot of other aspects in the book that we could talk about. I hope Peter will join the debate. I look at the sources of the problem. What is it that drives people to become terrorists, and what steps the United States could take today if we're trying to implement this strategy of not relying primarily on force. I hope to get into all of those things, but let me end this part of the presentation with a couple of comments about contemporary issues. And this is, as Peter knows, I've been engaged in the last few days in an online debate on the New Republic website with another one of our Afghan traveling companions, Rel Mark Garect, who has a very different view of these issues from me. And some of the issues that arise in that debate I want to take a moment to clarify here, because they're obviously at the cutting edge of where the type of strategy I'm proposing meets alternatives that we face. So let me just say three things. One, on the use of force, because I want to make clear as I make this case that this war isn't so much a traditional war, and therefore military force isn't the main component of it. I want to be clear that I think force has a component in this war on terror. There are times when the United States is going to have to use military force. Afghanistan, to me, was a classic example of that. We were attacked by a group that was operating out of Afghanistan and was harbored by the leaders of that country. And we made it very clear that that was an intolerable situation, and those leaders had to either turn over those who attacked us or would be subject to attack themselves. They failed to do the former, and we did the latter. That seems to me a perfectly legitimate use of force, one we carried out more or less well, and we did so with the broad support of nations all around the world, legitimacy in the United Nations. We even involved the Iranians in the discussion of the politics of Afghanistan. So I want to be clear that I'm not arguing that we should never use or consider force. It needs to be an important component of what we're doing. I do argue, however, that when we consider force and when it's useful, we need to think through several steps in advance what happens when we use it, which should lead us to be a little bit more cautious about it than than my critics, I believe, have been. You often hear, in the case for a more offensive approach to the war on terror, what I would call a litany that Bush and Cheney and many of their supporters have expressed a number of times, which is that one reason we were attacked on 9/11 is that we failed to hit back hard enough when we were attacked in the past. And they talk about the Iranian hostage crisis and the Hezbollah bombing in '83 and Somalia and the USS Cole and the Africa embassy bombings, and give all of these examples. And what they say is, we were a paper tiger. We failed to respond, and they gathered that we didn't have the courage and the character to respond, as President Bush puts it, and therefore we're weak and we've invited further terrorist attacks. Well, maybe, and I certainly think it's right that there are cases when, as Rumsfeld would put it, weakness is provocative, and you don't want to convince people that there's no price to be paid for an attack against the United States. That seems to me obvious. But when you make that case, or when people make that case, that part of the problem here is that we didn't hit back hard enough, they rarely actually spell out what it is they had in mind. So what should we have done in all of these cases? Who would we have hit? How hard? And what would have happened after that? And when you do that, you understand a little bit better why Presidents Reagan, Clinton, Bush, Carter didn't pursue what Bush and Cheney seem to be saying is so obvious, a much more aggressive response. I mean, just to take a couple of examples, we could talk about each of them, but Somalia. In Somalia, actually, it was what led to the Somali disaster, in a proximate sense, was when we decided to go after those who had hit us. The warlord Aidid, who had hit the UN forces, we decided to go after him more vigorously, which is what led to the clashes, which led to Black Hawk Down, and so on and so forth. So it was actually in the context of our hitting them harder and getting tough that happened. Now you can say, well, we should have followed up. The problem was Clinton then backed out and okay, maybe, but what should we have done? Put in a force to occupy and hold Somalia? If that's what you want to argue, then argue it. But I think one of the lessons of Iraq is clear that it's not so easy to move in and suppress such a movement. Libya is another case where those who make this case about the importance of the use of force in terrorism say, Libya, Reagan responded to terrorism, hit them hard, and now Libya is out of the terrorism business. Well, wait a minute. It overlooks a minor thing called Lockerbie, which happened 2 years after Reagan used force against the Libyans in retaliation for terrorism. So they were still in the terrorism business in a big and tragic way. And they have gotten out of it, it appears, 10 years later after 10 years of multilateral sanctions sponsored by the UN. So you have to be careful about that, too. And then obviously Iraq is telling in this sense as well. I don't think anyone would argue that we didn't hit them hard enough in Iraq, again to use Cheney's expression. But it doesn't appear to me, and again I'd be interested in Peter's comments, that this has had the effect so desired. A statement that says we're not a paper tiger, you hit the United States, and we're going to respond big time militarily. I don't see any sign that this has led Al-Qaeda to say, "What, we underestimated the United States. We better get out of this business." On the contrary, it appears that it has given them a new recruitment ground and training ground rather than the opposite. So again, I want to be clear. I think force has a role to play, and there are cases when the United States will have to use it. But at a minimum, we need to think through several steps in advance where that force leads and try to avoid that situation in which we're creating a clash of civilizations that actually strengthens the adversary rather than weakens it. Second point I want to make is when I emphasize values, again, this is part of the debate I'm having with my critics, I am not so naive as to believe that somehow if we were just, we implemented the Geneva Conventions, then Al-Qaeda would start descending from the hills in Pakistan and turning in their weapons and everything would be fine. I don't think so. But that's not what this is about. That's not what our moral authority and upholding our values is about. It's not really about those committed terrorists who are determined to kill Americans and Westerners. It's about those millions or tens of millions or hundreds of million people out there who are on the fence deciding where their sympathies lie and whether they're going to strongly support us, whether they're going to be ambiguous, or whether they're actually going to join the terrorists. And that there I do think it plays. And that's why I think the values thing is important. Again, I'd be interested in Peter's comments, but it'd be difficult to persuade me that images of Abu Ghraib and stories of Guantanamo and details of the vice president trying to make sure that it's possible, that the vice president going up against John McCain to make sure it's possible that we can, that there's a loophole so that cruel and degrading treatment of prisoners is not punishable by law, and the president has a signing statement after the McCain amendment is passed that says the president can still do whatever he wants. I find it difficult to believe that doesn't have an impact on some of these people who are deciding whether they are with us or with the terrorists, to use the president's language. I think it does matter a lot. So no, it's not going to change the behavior of the Egyptian or Jordanian security services, but it might have something to do with the job that they have to tackle domestically. No, it's not going to interfere with our cooperation with European security services, but it may well affect European populations who in the end are going to vote on things like whether their country should support us in Afghanistan or vote with us in the UN on Iran and so on. So that's why I think the values debate actually plays into this. And as a final point, again, as I say, there are millions of other issues that we could discuss that are in the book and that I'm happy to talk about, but I'll just end with this one, which is I think we should be in the long run optimistic about this challenge. And I want to make clear that my plea for a type of containment strategy and my urging of us to, at a minimum, do no harm as we respond to the terrorist challenge doesn't mean that we just have to sit around, accept it, and life is going to be difficult and scary forever. I think in the long run, just as Kennan thought about the communists, their ideology is doomed to fail. And I don't know how long it will take, but I think that in the long run, Muslims are not going to want to be associated with extremist terrorist movements. They won't want their religion to be seen in that way. Muslim mothers will not want their sons to be engaged in such activities. They'll overreach, their strategies will fail, and they, and not we, will start transforming the world around us, as long as we don't do things in the meantime that perpetuate a struggle that I think will come to an end. Why don't I stop with that optimistic, the only optimistic note of the afternoon, and turn it back over to Peter.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Phil. That was extremely stimulating, and we'll throw it open to questions. You should ID yourself, but I just wanted to make a couple of observations that some are prompted by some of Phil's and maybe ask a couple of questions also. I mean, I completely agree about the long-term optimism, because I think Al-Qaeda and jihadi groups basically have four strategic weaknesses that will do them in over time. One is they keep killing Muslim civilians. This has already done them in Indonesia and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Two, they don't offer a positive vision of the future. We know what they're against, but what are they really for? Most Muslims don't want to live in the bin Laden utopia of Afghanistan under the Taliban. Three, they keep adding to their list of enemies. I can't think of a category of institution, person, or government that Al-Qaeda or allied groups have said they're that they are they're against, whether it's Muslims who disagree with them, or Shias, or Jews, or Russia, or China, or the UN, or international media. The list goes on. And finally, these groups are not mass political movements, and I don't think they will ever turn themselves into that. Obviously, Hezbollah is a mass political movement because it has social welfare services and schools and the like. The idea of an al-Qaeda hospital is sort of oxymoronic in the extreme, and so, in the long term, these groups will simply disappear from. And that's why, I completely agree with Phil that sort of a strategy of containment, do no harm, makes sense. And that was basically Kennan's insight about communism, in the sense that communism was a bad set of ideas that would collapse of its own badness over time. And clearly these are a bad set of ideas that will collapse of their own badness. And unfortunately, with the Iraq War, which Phil wanted me to comment on, obviously this was quite counterproductive. And a colleague of mine at NYU, we looked at the question of what was the actual effect of the Iraq War on jihadist terrorism, and we found a 7-fold increase in jihadi terrorist attacks. If you compare the period between September 11th, 2001 and the invasion, and the period between the invasion and 2006, 7-fold increase in the rate of jihadi terrorist attacks, a lot of that happening in Iraq, a good deal of it in Afghanistan, a good deal of it around the Arab world, and of course, and some of it in Europe. And we didn't make the argument the Iraq War causes all jihadi terrorism, we just made the argument, but it certainly amplified it. But let me ask you a sort of a question here, which is, Bruce Hoffman and David Kilcullen have both in different ways said essentially we're facing a global counterinsurgency, or we need to have a global counterinsurgency. And I guess I may be characterizing their statements, but that somehow the ratio would be 20% military versus 80% other kinds of approaches. And Kilcullen has also said something which I think echoes something that you say, which is, we really, to use a horrible word, we really need to disaggregate our enemies, which I think is correct. So, is what you're saying basically quite similar to what Kilcullen is saying, or do you have differences with him? Or and the other thing, in terms of containment, of course, we did go into Korea and lost 50,000 people there, and we went into Vietnam and lost 50,000 people there, and then we also sponsored the Afghan rollback of the Russians in the 80s. So how does that history play into, analogies are imperfect, but it seemed that we were prepared to spend a great deal of blood and treasure with our containment strategy.
Mm-hmm. Well, two good questions. On the first, in the counterinsurgency, I do agree with Kilcullen. He, among others, have said that the terrorist threat to us is real. But what's really threatening is our potential response. Mm-hmm. That we shouldn't downplay the degree of damage that terrorists can do, and I'm happy to talk about how we need to put that in perspective and how great it really is. But what really is risky is how we respond to it. And I think we need to be very careful not to play in their hands and allow what is a real but not necessarily cataclysmic threat to turn into a cataclysmic conflict, a clash of civilizations, major wars. And obviously Iraq is a great example of that. To the extent that Iraq was a response to 9/11, the losses, financial and physical, in Iraq vastly outweigh the threat that allegedly was posed by that. In terms of strategy and counterinsurgency strategy, there's no better place for how to think about this than in the Army counterinsurgency manual directed by General David Petraeus, which is ironic because Petraeus has more articulately than anyone, I think, rejected the Bush administration approach to deal with these things. He's made a very powerful case, for example, of why prisoner mistreatment can lose us, in his case, a counterinsurgency campaign, but to the extent this is a global counterinsurgency campaign, it's the same thing. That word of prisoner abuse gets out very quickly, and it turns those who are on the fence against those perpetrating it. And he says that in a counterinsurgency campaign within a country, you need to be very careful about things like that, or sweeps that pick up a lot of people, most of whom are innocent, but then who turn against you because they're suffering the consequences of your policy. And so we really need to think about the consequences of our policy for the many millions of Muslims out there who have nothing to do with this, but in our zeal to go and get the few that do, we end up alienating and driving some others into the wrong camp. And I don't know what the right number. You talked about what percent should be military, what percent should not be, and I have no idea what the right but I don't think it's possible to come up with the right balance, but I do think it's possible to say that we've got the wrong balance now. I mean, it's probably 100 to 1 in terms of budgetary allocations, if not other, the energy and the focus and the political attention on the military side, and that seems to me vastly out of whack. We'll get up to $500 billion per year on the military, and that's not even including the costs of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, compared to the efforts that we're putting into economic development, PR campaigns, and structural support for democracy that I think would probably do a lot more in this struggle than on the military side. I mean, just to cite the latest statistic, there are more people in the military marching bands than there are in the State Department. Now, I have nothing against, let me just be clear, I'm a great fan of military marching bands, but you would think that our State Department should, that balance probably isn't the right one. And then just briefly on the Korean War, Vietnam War, obviously there was, as I said, there was a military containment, there was a military component to the Cold War. We had to pick and choose our battles. It's a little bit different, and that's where the analogy, I think, is indeed imperfect. There was a geographical component to containment as well, with armies from other states that we had to physically contain. That doesn't apply in the same way here. What is relevant, though, about the analogy, it was doing what you could to be defensive while eroding the ideology of the adversary. And so the geographical part of that analogy is imperfect, but the ideological component of it is what I think works very well.
Great, actually, and one more quick comment here, and then we'll throw it open to questions. Paul Berman wrote a book called Terror and Liberalism, which I think was the first book that really kind of popularized the idea that essentially we've seen this movie before in the 20th century. It's the fight against communism, there's the fight against fascism, and I always thought there were several problems with this argument. One, we're not in an existential struggle, which I think you agree with. If these guys got very lucky, they could close down an American city for a period of time, but that certainly doesn't, it's clearly still not existential. Two, communism and fascism do things one thing they do very quickly is abolish God as a sort of alternate power center. And our enemies, whatever else they are, they certainly believe in God, and it seems to a sort of imperfect analogy. And I guess, Berman, I think, used the phrase Islamofascism, and there's another problem with the Islamofascism idea, which is fascism is clearly something is about nationalism. And our enemies, what they want to do is create a borderless state from Indonesia to Morocco. They don't recognize nation states. So it seems to me, in all these different categories, this is a sort of misunderstanding, and maybe a very kind of understandable one, which is that people want to sort of see things in the same frame that they've seen things for a long time, but it just seems to me these are very different kinds of struggle.
Well, let me say something. You're actually pointing to a general problem with analogies, and having just made one, I don't want to fully embrace that, but of course it's right. As a general principle, I think that analogies tend to do more harm than good. I mean, we've seen that. There's Jeff Record's book about Munich, how it has led us into all sorts of mistakes. You take one very different situation and you analogize it and draw lessons. So I want to, I'm careful with mine. All I'm suggesting is there's one essential truth about the Cold War analogy that really we should keep in mind today. I mean, obviously I draw specific lessons, but the essential notion that it was the type of struggle that we had to defeat over the long term, largely defensively, and by showing that our system and our beliefs were better than theirs and that theirs contained the seeds of their own destruction. I think that's an important element to draw from this analogy. But you're right that analogies can get you in trouble, and they're all over the place now. I mean, the president actually has used almost every analogy under the sun, including the Cold War. We agree on that this is like the Cold War. And he makes a very eloquent case about how the communists were like the enemy we face now, and they were violent, and they thought that they had the history on their side. But we just have very different views about what ultimately defeated the communists and what lessons to draw from that. But Bush is also, in the VFW speech of about a month and a half ago, there was the Korean War analogy, and then there was even Vietnam. So this has been like World War II, the Cold War, Vietnam and Korea. Vietnam, he did the Japan and Korea analogies basically, the extent of the analogy, as far as I could tell, was these were situations that were at one point going badly, and then later they got better. And so that might be like the current situation, just because things are going badly at the beginning. And I think, in what was really a stretch, said, well, people doubted that there could be democracy in Japan then, but then it turned out to be the case. So don't give up hope on Iraq. I think, to an analogy, you need to a little bit more than that. That there was a place where people doubted democracy once, and then it happened, because I think, and we don't need to go into it, but the conditions for democracy in Japan, ethnically homogeneous society, economic development, neighbors not interfering, compared to Iraq, where none of those are the case, doesn't really help us. So all of these have been used and abused. Last point on the existential, I do want to underscore that. I think you're absolutely right, and that's a key difference here, and that's what I meant about the wrong war, World War II, World War III. If we faced a genuinely existential threat, and then it might actually be worth going to world war and spending 5 years and doing what we had to do last time. But we don't. The reality is that we don't. There is a very important risk of terrorists getting their hands on a nuclear weapon. I won't even say weapons of mass destruction, because chemical weapons aren't weapons of mass destruction. Biological is a serious threat. But the main, even this isn't existential, but the main concern is a nuclear weapon. Short of that, the damage that terrorists can inflict on our society is limited. It's far more limited than the fascists could do by taking over Europe, or with Japan, the Far East, or that the Soviets and the communists could do with their massive armies and eventually nuclear weapons. And that, the threat variable is important in the response variable, because you have to decide what is worth doing in order to deal with that threat. And in the book, I take the risk of putting it in perspective, which is also hard for Americans to do, because it sounds like you're minimizing terrorism, and one shouldn't. But one really should get a sense of what it is that we're talking about. I mean, I cite the numbers in the book comparing terrorism to the other challenges we face, other things that cause death, and just to put it in perspective, you have in a given year, you have about a 1 in 9,000 chance of being in an automobile accident, and a 1 in 18,000 chance of being murdered. And if you take the years since 9/11, you have a 1 in 500,000 chance of being killed in a terrorist attack. And if you take not only back to 9/11 including it, but go back another 5 years, that's about 1 in a million, whereas the other numbers don't change. So you have a 1 in 18,000 chance of being murdered and a 1 in a million chance of being killed in a terrorist attack. Proportionately, how do we struggle with those, with those different risks? It's very different psychologically, because a terrorist attack just feels like something that is intolerable, it can come out of nowhere. But of course, the same is true for murder. But nobody proposes that to deal with that 1 in 18,000 chance of being murdered, that we deploy hundreds of thousands of police officers and indefinitely detain previous armed criminals because of this risk and so on. So I want to be careful. I don't mean to belittle the concern about terrorism. It's very serious. And I made this, I was actually in New York yesterday and made a similar argument, and a woman put up her hand and said she lost her son in the 9/11 attack, which sort of makes you realize, we're not, these numbers are real things. But then she went on to say, I completely agree. We need to think about our response proportionately, and a major war in the Middle East that kills many more people isn't the right way to deal with what is a very serious risk. So that, I think, also needs to be kept in mind as we consider how we respond to the threat.
Okay, so questions. If you can ID yourself when you ask.
Alan Nichols, Washington Diplomat Magazine. You said, you alluded earlier that you have a section in your book about what are the causes of, what causes someone to become a terrorist. And Bush throws out, well, they hate us.
Right.
They have all kinds of myths about that. Could you clarify what you think causes an educated, and many of them are educated, a terrorist, and how we can learn from the dynamics?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I hope we can draw out Peter on this as well, because he's done some of the best work on that subject. I have thought a lot about it and write about it in the book. One thing I would say as a preface is it turns out it's a lot easier to take down the myths of what caused people to become a terrorist than to really explain what does. Because I could give you 6 or 7 different theories that have been put forward as to what causes terrorism and explain why none of them is really certainly a sufficient condition, and that there are all sorts of exceptions. So it's really hard to do, but obviously it's important. I would say, just to be brief about it, a couple of things, and again I hope Peter will comment. And I would start with what it isn't. And the first thing that it isn't is the hatred of freedom. More than anything, that's what President Bush has focused on. He said it right from the start, and he said it ever since. They attack us because they hate freedom. They hate our freedom of assembly. They hate our freedom of speech. That seems to me clearly not the case. There are plenty of free countries out there that the terrorists are not attacking because they're free. Bin Laden himself said, we would attack Sweden if that was what we were most interested in. And no doubt some of these terrorists don't like the American way of life, but that doesn't seem to be what causes them to attack us. I think another thing that it's not mostly is poverty. It's often also said that what we need to do is, take people out of poverty and then there wouldn't be terror. So there too, while I do think that there is an indirect link that I'm happy to talk about, the direct link just doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, Haiti and Madagascar would be producing lots of terrorists, but instead what we see is sometimes very rich societies are producing terrorists, and including rich individuals. Osama bin Laden to start with, I don't think poverty is the cause of his terrorism. Muhammad Atta, middle class, Zawahiri is a doctor. We just saw the doctors in London. So it turns out that poverty, often the most impoverished nations, people are trying to get by, and they're not, thinking about how to change the world through political violence. I would say, though, in terms of an indirect link with poverty, that the lack of success of most of the Arab nations probably has something to do with it. Because what I'm going to drive towards here in my argument is that alienation and humiliation does seem to be a strong driving factor. I mean, something is taking these people and making them so angry that they're willing to use violence to achieve their aims. And so and again, Peter's written about this and alienated Muslims in Europe and so forth. The lack of success of these Arab societies does seem to me to be one of the driving forces. So, here are people, and they're often educated as well, and that's why another thing I would take off the list is education. People think if you just educate them more, they won't become terrorists. Alas, they're probably more likely to become terrorists if they're educated, because it takes an educated person to have a theory about why they're oppressed and why things aren't working out. And it's rarely just a very poor, uneducated person. I think Peter has made that point about madrasas as well not being the main source of this. But it does seem to me that when these people look at the fate of the Muslim world and the Arab countries in general, and they see that their former colonial oppressors in Europe and America have surpassed them and now dominate them, and they see that the Asians have come from nowhere and are far more advanced than Islamic civilization, and they say that Israel pops up in their midst and in 60 years is stronger and richer and more successful, that contributes to the humiliation, because humiliation has to be an important part of this explanation. And so in that sense, it's not really poverty, but a lack of balanced economic development has left these societies behind. And that's very frustrating and humiliating, and one of the things, no doubt, that drives them in that direction. The last thing I'll mention, and there are other candidates, well, I should mention two. One is lack of democracy, because Bush mentions that also a lot, that it's the lack of democracy in these countries that drives people to become terrorists. There must be some link in there, and that I do think that repression in these countries also contributes to frustration, anger, humiliation, and they can't get rid of their own leaders that they don't like, so they blame us. And so I accept that. I believe that can be part of the contributing factor, but it's clearly there too neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition. There are plenty of repressive countries in the world that don't produce terrorists. China, Cuba, Venezuela. These, so the absence of democracy in itself doesn't seem to me to be the cause. And there are also plenty of democratic countries from which terrorists have come. People living in Britain and Spain and India have become terrorists, and that's not because those countries aren't democratic. So there too, we should be careful about attributing some direct causality. Then last thing I'll say, and I hope this underscores why I think this is such a complicated issue, is modernity and actually economic development, on one hand, helps with the problem because it deals with some of the issues I was talking about before, income inequality and lack of development, but it also poses part of the problem because it's a challenge to people who have lived in traditional societies to accept globalization and rapid economic change and the shock to the system. So the economic transformation of the world culturally with American Western culture flooding in over the internet and movies and economic change, these things also disrupt traditional societies in ways that I think can alienate people and lead them to become terrorists. Although in the long run, I think modernization, while it poses these challenges, is also part of the answer, as inevitably they get used to these things being part of their society and the society is transformed, even if only slowly and with great difficulty. Peter, do you want to?
Well, Phil, that was a brilliant response, and I think that, I basically agree with everything you've said. I think this feeling, if Bernard Lewis and Osama bin Laden agree on something, it may even be true. And Bernard Lewis, made the point in The Crisis of Islam that, it's a sense of, former splendors gone away, and of course the British and the French divided the Ottoman Empire, and bin Laden on October 7, 2001 actually really kind of explicitly referred to that. He talked about the 80 years of humiliation that we felt. He talks about the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, which he sees in the same way that the Treaty of Versailles was saw by Adolf Hitler, something that must be avenged and reversed. And so I think humiliation is very important. Alienation, I think, certainly in the case of European immigrants, is important. We have an American dream here. It's worked very well for American Muslims. There's no British dream that I'm aware of, or EU dream certainly. And the 9/11 plot really took shape in Hamburg as much as it took place in Afghanistan. So the alienation as Phil says, it's easier to say what really doesn't cause it, poverty, madrasas, etc., but to actually really identify it. There is no sort of unified field explanation of what causes terrorism, because a lot of it differs. Somebody who does a terrorist attack in Indonesia is going to have different motivations than somebody sitting in Hamburg dreaming up 9/11. And I think that this lack of democracy question is sort of an interesting one, because I agree with the president that, it's not an accident that there's so many people in Al-Qaeda are Saudis, Yemenis, and Algerians and all these, and so that's something to do with repression. Yet, I think the academic literature will show that as countries become more democratic, there's actually the likelihood of more violence. And so if we're serious about democratization in the Middle East, it would likely produce a lot of it could produce effects that at least in the medium term would be quite counterproductive, because at least in Saudi Arabia right now, I was in Saudi when they had their first elections, and talking to even dissidents there, their view is, look, if democracy is like what is happening on our border in Iraq, we don't really want that. The one thing that stands between basically chaos and is the House of Saud. And that's what a lot of Saudis genuinely think. And so a serious push for democratization in the Middle East might have a lot of counterproductive consequences in terms of actually creating more violence rather than less.
Mm-hmm. I'll just add very briefly, one thing that's vividly underscores why there's not a single explanation for terrorism. Take Richard Reed and Osama bin Laden. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, a sort of low life who bounced around London, poor, comes from Western Europe, democratic country, and Osama bin Laden, rather different history, and they both buy into the same movement. So to find one explanation of why these two very different people end up in the same place is obviously a hopeless.
And I'd add to that, Mohammed Atta and Ziad Jarrah are a very interesting case study, because Ziad Jarrah, who was a Lebanese playboy, he had a girlfriend who might have even been his wife, he was a drinker, he was one of the pilots. And Mohammed Atta, a misogynist and unpleasant guy to be around, they could not be more different. And so and maybe, can I add one sort of maybe un-PC observation, which is, religion has got quite a lot to do with this. This is not a critique of Islam, but, the largest suicide campaign in history is being conducted in Iraq right now largely by foreigners. And what is motivating them? It is a understanding of Islam, maybe obviously a minority one, but you can't misunderestimate that, as it were, as a kind of contributing factor. And I think it would be naive to pretend otherwise. The Quran is not a book; it's the Word of God. There's a lot of ammunition in the Quran to justify these kinds of attacks. In fact, in Iraq, it's a classic defensive jihad, which a lot of Muslims can get around. It's not even just an offensive jihad. So, religion does seem to be. If Osama bin Laden was here, he would say it's all about the defense of Islam. And so I think it's important to actually listen to what people are saying. Just as it's not about Hollywood and Madonna, it is about our foreign policies in the Middle East. The frame in which bin Laden sees it is definitely one as a defense of Islam.
Excuse me. I'm Victor Bass, a consultant in national security policy. Basically, I agree with you that is containment. What in a sense, in effect, what you're saying, we shouldn't have used hard power as much. We should have used soft power. And containment is one form of the soft power, and then you use various elements of it. And I think you're right that we have the right weapons, our ideology, our values, and so on and so forth. The real question is this: how do we make these weapons work faster? It's, in the long run, it's true. We have our ideology, our values, and in the long run, they will win. But how do we do it faster? And here, the analogy of the Cold War is a little weak in this sense. It was not our ideology, and it was not our values that killed the Soviet Union. What killed the Soviet Union was technology, because technology made the Soviet economy so complex that it couldn't be run by command economy. So I did a major study on that subject under the auspices of Office of the Secretary of Defense, and I concluded, what happened there was really, first, the Soviet Union was growing under the command economy at 9%, then further down to 6%, 3%, and so on and so forth. Why? Because the command economy was not functional. When technology was not that widespread, you can order somebody at the bottom, do this, and he will do it. But when the complexity of the economy became such that it didn't work, then Kosygin, the prime minister of the Soviet Union at that time, realized, look, we got to move to a market principle. And he tried to introduce market principle because the economy began to grow at 2%. And that's not sustainable for the Soviet Union.
Okay, well, so, let Phil comment on this.
Okay, let me finish. So my study, the Office of the Secretary of Defense was excited about it. We got to do something about it, and I said that there will be reforms in the Soviet Union in the 80s, and I did my study in '79. Major reforms towards a market economy. We got to capitalize on this and translate this into economic progress. My study was considered at Harvard at a special conference for my study, and out of the 20 Soviet specialists, 19 said it will never happen. Only one from MIT said that it's possible. So the Office of the Secretary of Defense lost interest in my study. But the question is this: indirectly, our ideology, and here your emphasis on modernity and economic development is definitely relevant, because it was market economy, our principle, that was relevant for the Soviet Union, not so much values and other things. But it didn't work. What made the Soviets collapse was the market mechanism.
Okay. Do you want me to address this now? Okay. Well, two things. You asked, what can we do? You agree, but what can we do to accelerate the process? Not a lot. I mean, we have to do the right things, and Americans are so impatient, and we want to use our power and our abilities to quickly transform things and get results. We can't do that. We can't accelerate this. We can do the right things, and I gave you a few examples of what I think the right things would be, and they also fall in the category of not making things worse. But we have to protect ourselves and be patient enough that to let this process work. There's not a quick fix to this one, and attempts to have a quick fix will only make it worse. As for the Soviet Union, again, of course, it's an imperfect analogy. There were a lot of different things that led to the downfall of communism and the Soviet ideology. But what's relevant here is that it failed to deliver. Communism failed to deliver on its stated aims, and that's what's analogous to this. There are people promising things in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, based on a certain view of the world that is analogous. The communists also promised a lot of things. And in the end, it took some time, but people gradually started to realizing that it was a fraud, and it was never going to deliver on its stated promises. And we have a tendency to look back at communism now as obviously a failure, but it wasn't so obvious then. In the 40s and 50s, it was not obvious that this was, and Khrushchev said, "We will bury you." He was confidently predicting that their system would beat our system. And there were plenty of people who believed that and were fervent in that belief. And they were dead wrong, and it took a while for them to see. So for whatever reason, that became clear, and I think that's the same thing that's going to happen to the extremists today.
For a quick question, I think your solution to all this makes a great deal of sense, but can you imagine any Democratic candidate or even a Republican candidate saying any of the things that you just said, because they would be seen as sort of weak on the war on terrorism?
Good point. This is hard politically, but it's not impossible. I do think they can and should say that we will win, that we're confident in our system, and we should easily be able to defeat this extremist ideology, and we should have. But of course, they have to say we need to do more on homeland security. And we need to aggressively pursue our enemies, and we need to go on the offensive as necessary. That is an inevitable part for all the reasons I said about what American political culture requires. But I do think there are aspects of it. They can and should say that an important weapon in this struggle are our values, and we need to therefore do things differently in all these areas that I've talked about. And I think Americans would that would resonate with Americans. Most of them agree with it.
Okay. Yeah.
Steve Zabel, German Marshall Fund. Phil, thanks for an excellent presentation. Actually, I wanted to follow up on this issue, which is you have to ask yourself, why is the Bush-Cheney narrative the dominant narrative right now? And I would think that in addition to what you said, you think about the strategic culture of the U.S. We like big wars. We don't like insurgency. We love World War II. Ken Burns is doing it again. And the military is the same way, except for the American Indian Wars. I don't think we've been very good at this kind of thing. So it's hard to sell this kind of strategic approach to the American public or the American military. And then in addition, you have this political problem. That's interesting, your views on the Democrats here, because I understand that Todd Horwitz is now an advisor to Giuliani in his campaign. So I mean, the Republicans are going to be able to take this issue every time and push the Democrats. We have to prove that they're real men, into the corner. So I just wonder, I mean, your argument's making a lot of sense, but it sounds more like a European argument than an American.
All right, let me address that.
He does speak French.
Be careful what you call him. On the politics of this, Steve, you'll appreciate this. I made a presentation at SAIS recently, and under David Kaleo's auspices, and he listened and he said, what the strategy should really be is appeasement. And I said, well, there may be elements of that, but it's not what I would recommend to a political candidate as they're trying to describe. I mean, we knew what he meant, but it underscored the point that you have to be careful in the way this is presented. But that's why I think there's actually even something politically useful in harking back to the Cold War. Because who are greater Americans than Truman and Eisenhower? And what did they do? They adopted a largely defensive strategy. They underscored the importance of values in fighting the Cold War and doing the right thing, and they were explicit about it and said we have to be a model to defeat the others. We have to stand up to them and fight them if we need to, but we also have to preserve our. Eisenhower was very worried about the military-industrial complex and the effect of that in the war on terror. Truman was worried about America becoming a garrison state, and even took some domestic liberal initiatives to show the communists. Kennedy did the same thing. So Democrats shouldn't be afraid of appealing to Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy. Also on alliances. They liked alliances, and Eisenhower has these great quotes. I quote him in the book a couple of places about leadership. And the way you lead is not by telling your subordinates, I'm higher ranked than you, so damn it, get in line and do what I tell you. It's to be a model and inspire them to want to follow you. If that's good enough for Eisenhower, why shouldn't it be good enough today? Rather than you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. Why not give people a reason to want to follow the United States like Eisenhower did, rather than just tell them we were attacked and we're strong and you better get in line? So I think in terms of presenting this, there is something to be said for looking back how we defeated this threat before and using some of these great leaders as models. As for the political debate coming up, I actually think this is going to be the debate. There is a difference. I mean, for all Bob Kagan's comments about how there's an American view of foreign policy, there are differences between Democrats and Republicans, and a lot of them are in the areas that I'm talking about. Clinton and Obama want to close Guantanamo, and Romney wants to double it and have 10 more, or whatever he said in the debate. Giuliani wants an offensive war on terror and has hired Norman Podhoretz, who's written about World War IV, as his foreign policy advisor. And there are other views on the Democratic side. So I think these are serious issues. They deserve a serious debate. They deserve alternative methods for how to deal with a serious problem, and I think we're going to get them. I think the debate between the Democrat and the Republican is going to be very much over how much force, military force, is supposed to not force, how offensive is supposed to not offensive. How much do we emphasize values, and how much do we emphasize security, and whatever it takes? And Americans will decide which type of approach they prefer. And I'm trying to make the case that one is better than the other.
Okay.
Miriam Savage from Catholic University. I'm wondering, I agree with what you're saying. It all sounds very rational, and it strikes me that one of the aspects of the dilemmas that we have is kind of apocalyptic view of the world, that both not only the terrorists own, but also that there are people in the United States that also participate from the opposite side, which is this idea that somehow the second coming is going to happen, and that this is not just a strategic debate, but it's really about the kind of view of what the good life is, and who's going to be the winning, and who's going to go to heaven. And so how do you parse all of these, kind of different way of even talking about it, or even understanding the world? And to what extent that is not part of the challenge that we confront?
Yeah, well, first, Steve called me European, you called me rational. I don't know what I have to face next. Yeah, exactly, fighting words. Look, you raise an important part of the challenge. When people, as Peter said, are driven from a religious belief, it's hard to be rational and argue with them. You just have to have, I would say, two things. One is you have to have confidence that degree of religious or extremist fervor results from some sort of sickness or lacking in the society that we've tried to describe. It doesn't come from nowhere and therefore can't be dealt with. It's the product of some things. It's not happening everywhere. It's happening in specific places for specific reasons, and you do have to be confident that it's not the natural order of things, and it can be combated through a whole range of the types of issues that I'm talking about. But the second thing I would say is, if you do take the view that it is an implacable, that it can't be solved, it can't be treated, and it will always be there, what policy flows from that? I mean, you see what I'm saying? If you take the view that there are irrational, extremist people who always will be, and we can't do anything about the causes of it, and their religious fervor is going to carry them to be our enemies forever, what do you do then? I mean, that's almost what I think is driving the Podhoretz sort of argument that says, this is all nonsense. You can't treat it through diplomacy or development or modernization. There are evil people out there, and we need to go and deal with them. If that's what you believe, again, fine, but I don't even know what the solution is then. Do we kill and capture and lock away all the people who we think might end up in this category? I don't think we can do that.
That's what I said, because what I'm arguing, what I'm questioning is the fact that there is an Islamic apocalyptic view, but there is also a Christian and there's also a Jewish view. And so the question is, how do you articulate the vision so that it kind of quiets this kind of apocalyptic view?
Right.
doesn't see it as, well, this is a sickness, because then people are going to become defensive.
Yeah.
But to kind of acknowledge that we also have these kind of apocalyptic dimensions both in American society and throughout the world. And how do we engage that? And part of the difficulty and also the appeal that Bush has had to fundamentalist Christians is that they hear him talk in terms that they feel listened to.
Yeah, well, I don't know if Peter wants to add anything. I would say, when you bring up other religions and extremist interpretations of them, that's part of my point about this resulting from conditions. I think most major religions or minor religions have within them the seeds of an extremist view. And under certain conditions that comes out more than others, and other religions have gone through those phases as well and largely emerged from them, not completely because they're still there. And so the challenge with Islam today is I don't think there's anything inevitable in Islam that leads people to that sort of interpretation of it, but something is happening that is driving people to do it. But it does give you hope, I think, that in the long run it needn't be interpreted in that more extremist way.
Pete Shumley from Brookings. First, thanks very much. I really liked your outline and presentation. A specific question which follows up this earlier question. If you recommend certain steps that we should take, other than your sort of your broad overview ones, where I'm coming from is back to your Cold War analogy. Initially in the Cold War, the U.S. basically viewed things from a defensive way, but then it began to get more offensive in two ways. USIA was created in '53, and so the propaganda arm ginned up. And then after Helsinki and Carter, human rights was sort of an offensive message that the U.S. pushed. Mm-hmm. And my question is, if you're in your book making any suggestions in policy terms along those lines?
Yeah, lots of them. I won't go through them all, but I gave you a list of things in the values category I think we need to do. Close Guantanamo, adopt Geneva Conventions, allow Red Cross visits to detainees, have a policy of transparency so that people know what we're doing, coming clean on all of these things, I think would have an impact. I think we need to continue what we're trying to do in Afghanistan with resources to make that work, to combat the very place from which the 9/11 terrorists came. I think we have to find a way out of the Iraq quagmire, which is, as I said, costing us $4 billion a week and not only draining incredible amounts of resources, but also serving as a provocation to some of the terrorists that want to attack us. I think we need to change our energy policy, not only because it's in our economic and environmental interest to do so, but because our degree of dependence on oil leads to oil states, which tend to be autocracies, which tend to be repressive, which tend to be part of the problem. On what you call the propaganda area, I'm all for getting the good word out about the United States, though I'm skeptical about public diplomacy and efforts to do so. I mean, you have to have the right message. If you have the right message, it'll get out. There's enough satellite TV and open media in the world today that stories will be told. And creating American stations to try to tell that story, it depends what your story is. So I'm more for doing the right thing in our own society as a model than trying to tell people that we're doing the right thing in our own society as a model. And I think there are positive things we can do, and we obviously need to protect ourselves through homeland security. But the main message is, again, one that says, do no harm, contain the threat, and expect that our adversaries will fail on their own.
Take a couple more questions. Go ahead.
Yes, Tom Lynch, Executive Fellow of the Brookings, sorry, it's not a Brookings pylon here, but and this hasn't been a prearranged question, but I'm interested in going back to methodology on the Cold War, because I find it interesting and useful that you're approaching this in terms of a clash with an ideology, indeed a radical ideology that values violence and apocalyptic violence as the only way to make change. But the question I have is, you're picking a portion of the Cold War where also apocalyptic ideology that valued the destruction of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat and then manifest itself into statist type approach had already co-opted and captured a state to base on. Okay? And we are not at that point right now with this ideology. And actually, some observers, to include a former boss of mine named John Epizade, who was a thing or two about the Middle East, has argued that the time is now to get out front of ideology, as one were getting out front of the Hitlerian ideology, which was also destructive based on the Aryan mythology and also designed to co-opt and dominate the world, before it gets a hold of a base from which to get what it argues in its propaganda it wants, which is access to nuclear devices, which its major writers say they will use, both to assure the greater caliphate in the Middle East and then to continue the persecution and the prosecution of their worldview, which even if you strip away the value of Islam, is a very radicalized, very kafir or very intolerant view of even fellow Muslims or how they would run the world. So my question is, are we entering the analogy at the right point? And then what does that do to some of the policy prescriptions, even if one as myself could agree, this has got to be more than just about the military. It's got to do a lot of the things you're talking about. But the issue here is how aggressive one has to be to stay out in front of these guys, to deny them access to what they want, which is a state from which, like Saudi Arabia or someplace else, to acquire these weapons and go forward. Because if we don't get out in front of it now, one, who will? The states of the Middle East aren't strong enough to do it. And two, if they get what they want, then how do you stop them from doing what they will want to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a challenging set of issues. A couple of things. One is, I think we are trying to get out in front of it and prevent it from taking over a state. In a way, what we did in Afghanistan was just that. They had effectively had taken over that state, and were using it as a sanctuary, training base, recruitment center, all of that, and we didn't really get out in front of it. We reversed it. We said we're not going to tolerate that, and I think, as I've said, I think we did the right thing in that regard. We also, obviously, we try to do that in all the other cases. I mean, what are we trying to do in Pakistan now? We're trying to make sure that extremists don't get a hold of a state apparatus where they actually would have access to nuclear materials and weapons. That becomes a tricky issue, especially in the context of the democracy debate we had, because sometimes getting out in front of Al-Qaeda is giving support to horrible regimes that are also part of the problem. And that's one of the great dilemmas we face in all of this, is that efforts to prevent Islamists from taking over in Jordan and Egypt and Saudi Arabia equate to efforts to prop up the very regimes that provoke the Islamists. So it's an almost impossible challenge, and we're trying to find ways to have those societies evolve in a direction whereby if someone replaced the dictators, it wouldn't be Al-Qaeda and the extremists, but something else. But as we see in Iraq, that sure ain't easy, which is why I would say that a lot of what I'm talking about, I think, is an effort to get out in front of this, to persuade people that the extremist Islamist ideology is just not the one that they want to buy into, and so to lessen the threat against those regimes. And as I said, I admit, it's long-term and it's imperfect, but those are the choices now. In many of these countries, it's the current dictators or it's the extremists who would replace them. The last thing I would say about that is we may actually have to fail before we succeed. And I'm not prepared to recommend that as a strategy, but what I mean is, it sounds like John Kerry, I actually, I was for failure before I was for success. I think the quickest way to discredit an extremist, this extremist ideology, would be to let them take over.
Yeah.
I think we see that in Iran. Where is fundamentalist Islam most unpopular in the Middle East? In Iran, where people have had to live under it for almost 30 years. I think the Taliban did the same thing. And whereas they brought security initially, which people liked, they didn't necessarily like living under Taliban repression. So, just as in this, it took communism taking over the Soviet Union failing to turn Russians against communism, and it took, on a much milder level, the French effort to implement socialism to get the French to turn against that. You sometimes have to let it run its course and get people to turn against it. The reason I'm not recommending that as a strategy is you have to suffer the consequences in the meantime, and they could be grave. And so in Iran, I'm absolutely convinced that the Iranian people will not want forever to live under the mullahs. But I don't know how many decades will go by, or how many wars will take place, or how many nuclear weapons will be built in the meantime. So I'm not prepared to advocate. Others are. I mentioned Ruel, who I'm debating in the New Republic. I think basically advocates, look, if we have to let the Islamists take over Saudi Arabia first in order for democracy and liberalism to come later, then we have to do that. I think that's a neat debating point, but I personally as an American president or whatever, wouldn't be prepared to go that route.
Just a quick comment, because there is the MMA, which is the coalition of religious parties in Pakistan, got 12% in the election in 2002 when Musharraf basically fixed it so the secular parties wouldn't do well. They're now polling at 3.5%, so almost zero. And they're in the northwest frontier in Baluchistan, which they were largely running. They have, not made themselves popular. So in the one place where this has often been pointed out as a potential plausible development where Islamists might get hold of nuclear weapons, it's just not going to happen. And Musharraf has been quite adept at exploiting this fear that après moi le deluge, and that I'm the only person that's and in fact, the most popular politician in Pakistan is a woman by the name of Benazir Bhutto, who scores 63% to Musharraf's 38%. So in Pakistan, actually, I'm quite optimistic about the things that are happening and Benazir's return and the deal she'll do with Musharraf. This is all good news. So in the one place where this seemed like a perhaps plausible idea, I just don't see this happening. We'll take one more question.
Charles and freelance correspondence. When you people talk about the propaganda or public relation, actually they already created an office in State Department and move disputes from White House to State Department to do the work. And also from the last two questions, I think the winning the right war, this may be your first book. You talk about what's the right war. I think you may lead the team in the book. You already have two here. And then I think in no time you could write a book, How to Win the Right War.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I would say we should invest more in people like me than in Karen Hughes. But let me explain what I mean so that doesn't
to write a second book.
But let me explain so that it doesn't sound as bad as it did.
It is.
I think sending an official representative of a deeply unpopular administration to try to persuade people that we're actually okay just doesn't work. I mean, we saw her tour in Turkey where she went over and explained that we have a lot in common. We also like our children.
We all have kids.
Yeah, which was news to them. And the idea that these deeply hostile people would say, okay, thank you for explaining that. You're right. It just doesn't work. Whereas an individual, I don't mean me, but I mean people, Americans who are interested in these issues and hopefully have an open mind. The government did sponsor me to go to northwest Pakistan recently. And I had lots of debates just like this with students in Peshawar. And I think it was really constructive. I mean, we didn't agree on lots of things, but I do think they appreciated, especially they appreciated that the U.S. government was willing to finance someone who was critical of the U.S. government to go and have a dialogue with them about important issues. And I think that that's much better for our country and its image in the world and the exchange of ideas that we need than pumping money into propaganda radio stations or official State Department spokesman things. They have plenty of ways to get their message out, and human exchanges at the right level, I think, is a better way to do that.
But on that optimistic note.
Yeah.